When everything you've buried finally finds the surface, it doesn't ask for permission. It just rises, quiet, certain, like spring after the longest winter. We are about to hear this story right now. The estate smelled of cut hyacinths and fresh paint. Hermione noticed it the moment she stepped through the iron gates. That particular combination of something growing and something newly covered over, as though the world had agreed, collectively, to present its best face today and let the rest go unexamined. The gravel path was raked clean. The hedgerows were trimmed to architectural precision. Somewhere beyond the south garden, she could hear the distant, purposeful clinking of caterers arranging glassware, and the sound was so aggressively normal that it produced in her chest the faint and complicated ache it always did now. Normal was new. Normal required effort. Normal was something they were all collectively performing. She adjusted the strap of her bag and walked faster. The Vanthorpe estate had been lent to the Magical Orphan Relief Fund with a generosity that the society pages had described as unprecedented and that Hermione privately understood as guilty. It belonged to a family whose name had appeared 3 times in the post-war tribunals and emerged each time technically unscathed. The lawns were immaculate. The topiary had been charmed to hold the shape of Easter hares mid-leap, frozen at the top of their arc, and something about their suspended motion, caught between rising and falling, between one moment and the next, made her look away. She had 17 things to accomplish before the guests arrived at noon. She began with the wishing eggs. They were traditional, older than any spell she'd formerly studied, rooted in a branch of folk magic that predated the Ministry's classification system, and therefore occupied that interesting grey territory where something could be simultaneously ancient, legitimate, and entirely unregulated. Each egg was handcrafted from hollowed alabaster or blown glass, or, in rarer cases, compressed moonstone, and each contained a single compressed enchantment. A wish spell, technically, though the terminology was imprecise. The magic was responsive, sympathetic. It didn't grant wishes so much as it recognized something true in the person who opened it and offered a reflection. Harmless, the literature said. Intimate, but harmless. Hermione had read 4 texts on the subject last Tuesday. She had taken notes. The eggs for today's hunt were arranged in a long velvet case in the main hall, nested in ivory silk, like the contents of some eccentric jeweler's most unusual inventory. There were 37 of them. She had counted yesterday. She counted again now, a reflex she had developed somewhere around age 9 and never managed to extinguish, and confirmed 37 and began cross-referencing against the donor list. Each egg had been commissioned by a specific donor. Each was meant to find its specific recipient. The magic was, in theory, self-directing. The eggs were designed to remain sealed until the correct person held them. She had a chart. She had color-coded labels. She had a system that was, she felt, appropriately rigorous for enchanted alabaster objects that contained spells of ambiguous classification. She was halfway through the verification process when the door opened behind her, and every hair on the back of her neck rose in a way that had nothing to do with magic. She knew, before she turned, who it was. She turned anyway. It seemed important not to let the knowing show. Draco Malfoy stood in the entrance of the Vanthorpe main hall and looked, at first assessment, precisely as he always looked, arranged. That was the word that came to her, involuntarily, every time. Not dressed or presented, or even composed, but arranged, as though each element of his appearance had been placed with deliberate care, a deliberateness that was itself the point, a signal that nothing about him was accidental or unguarded. Pale grey robes, fitted at the shoulder and falling with expensive simplicity. Hair that was lighter than she remembered, and worn without the severe product of their school years. It fell slightly, just slightly, across his forehead, and she noticed this, and wished immediately that she hadn't. He was looking at her with an expression of entirely neutral assessment, the kind of expression that required practice. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy," she said. These were, she reflected, the only 2 syllables they had exchanged since a ministry corridor in February, when they had passed each other outside the Wizengamot chambers, and both performed the same elaborate pantomime of not quite making eye contact. The pantomime had lasted approximately 4 seconds, and had required, on her part, a level of concentration usually reserved for arithmetic theory. He crossed the hall without any particular hurry, hands in his pockets, and stopped a careful distance from the velvet case, far enough to be clearly uninvested, close enough to see what she was doing. "You're early," she said, because the silence had reached the specific density where it needed to be punctured before it became something else. "You've miscounted," he said. She looked down at her chart. "I have 37 eggs. The donor list specifies 37 commissions. 38. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his robes and produced a small card. Cream, embossed, the kind of stationery that cost more per sheet than her weekly groceries, and placed it on the table beside the velvet case without touching any of the eggs. "Late edition. It will have been delivered separately." She looked at the card. It listed 1 commission, donor name, D. Malfoy, recipient designation left intentionally blank. "Blank," she said. "Self-directing," he said. "The old ones work that way. You match the magic to the intention rather than the person." He said it the way he said most things now, with the particular flatness of someone who has learned to remove emphasis so that nothing sounds like it matters, because things mattering had, at some point, become too expensive. "That's—" She stopped. She was going to say, "That's irregular," which was true, and also, "That's fascinating," which was also true, and which she had no intention of saying to him in this hall at this hour. "That's noted. I'll look for the delivery." He nodded, and there was a pause, and she returned her attention to her chart, and she could feel him still standing there. Not looking at her, she didn't think, but present in the way that certain people were present, occupying space with an insistence that had nothing to do with intention. "The hare's outside," he said abruptly. She looked up. "In the topiary." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a wince, not quite anything definable. "They've charmed them at the wrong point in the arc. A hare at the apex of a jump looks as though it's suspended. It should look as though it's flying." She stared at him. He looked, momentarily, as though he wished he hadn't said it. "I'll mention it to the groundskeeper," she said carefully. He nodded again and turned and walked back toward the entrance. At the threshold he paused, his hand not quite touching the doorframe, and said, without turning around, "The 38th egg. Handle it carefully. The commission was specific." Then he was gone, and the hall was full of hyacinth smell and the distant clink of glassware and 37 alabaster eggs in ivory silk. And she stood for a moment with her colour-coded chart in her hand and her heart doing something she chose firmly not to examine. She had 15 things left to accomplish. She got back to work. By 10 o'clock, the estate had transformed. This was the particular genius of large-scale magical event preparation. The capacity for a space to become, inside of 2 hours, something wholly unlike itself. The main hall had shed its museum quality and become warm, improbably warm, strung with floating lights that the event coordinator had described as sun on water, and that Hermione had to admit were exactly that. Not candles, not globes, but something that moved the way light moves on the surface of a river, restless and lovely and slightly too alive. Long tables bore the beginnings of a lunch that smelled of rosemary and butter. Children from 3 of the fund's supported families had arrived early with their minders and were currently engaged in a ferocious negotiation about which Easter hair topiary was best. Hermione watched them from the garden doorway and felt the complicated ache again and breathed through it and was fine. The 38th egg had arrived at 9:45 in its own small case. Moonstone, as she'd half expected, faintly iridescent, the surface carved with an interlocking pattern of vines and small flowers that she recognized, after a moment, as the stylized white hawthorn that appeared in the older texts on wish magic. It pulsed when she lifted it. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition, the way a wand responds to its matched witch or wizard, that involuntary shiver of resonance. She set it in the case with the others, carefully as instructed. She did not think about who had commissioned it. Guests began arriving at 11, and by 11:30 the estate had reached that particular social critical mass where a party stops being a collection of individual people and becomes its own creature, a self-sustaining entity of conversation and movement and noise. Hermione moved through it with practiced efficiency, greeting donors, directing children, answering the 3 separate questions about the hunt's starting time with exactly the same words and exactly the same expression. She saw Draco twice at a distance. The first time, he was in conversation with a representative from the Wizengamot Reform Committee, a thin, anxious man who was clearly doing the work of appearing not to be anxious. And Draco was listening to him with that neutral patience that could, she knew, be genuine or performative, and was impossible to distinguish from the outside. He had a glass of something he wasn't drinking. He didn't look toward her. The second time, he was alone, standing at the edge of the garden with his back half turned to the party, looking out at the topiary hares. From where she stood, she could see the line of his shoulders, not tense exactly, but held, deliberately maintained at a particular elevation that prevented any possibility of reading what was happening beneath it. She moved on before he could turn. The hunt began at noon with a minor ceremony that Hermione had organized to be precisely 7 minutes long and had delivered at 6 minutes 45 seconds, because efficiency was the one area of her life she could still fully govern. The eggs had been distributed through the estate, tucked into garden alcoves, nested in window casements, hidden in the branches of the wisteria that climbed the east wall, and the guests moved through the grounds with the specific energy of adults who've been given permission to be delighted. The children were considerably more direct about it. A small girl in yellow robes had already located 4 eggs in the first 3 minutes, using what appeared to be a purely intuitive method that Hermione's entire classification system hadn't anticipated. She herself was supervising, not hunting. She had a clipboard. She had a chart of the egg placements. She was standing at the edge of the garden with a clear sightline to the main event area, and no intention of becoming involved in the actual hunt itself. Then one of the younger children, a boy, perhaps 5, in green robes 3 sizes too large, came running across the grass toward her, with his arms outstretched and a full-speed, unsteerable quality to his trajectory that made evasion impossible. She dropped to a half-crouch on instinct and caught him, and he pressed a small, cool object into her hands with the absolute confidence of someone who has found the correct person and has no doubts about this. "That one's yours," he said, with total authority. "It's the glowy one. It doesn't open for me." She looked down at what he'd placed in her palms. Moonstone, hawthorn vines, iridescent and very faintly warm. Her hands around it did not feel like her hands. Later, much later, she would think about how it felt in the moment of opening. Not dramatic, not violent. It wasn't the crack of a stunning spell or the rush of apparition. It was something far quieter and far more irreversible. A sound like a single note played on an instrument she didn't have a name for, and then a warmth that moved through her fingers, up her wrists, into her chest like the first genuine heat after a long cold season, and settled there in the exact center of her, precise as a compass needle finding north. She stood up. Across the garden, 40 feet away, Draco Malfoy turned from the topiary hares and looked directly at her with an expression she had never once seen on his face. Not neutral, not arranged. Something she didn't have a word for yet. The boy in the green robes had already run off, utterly satisfied, toward the next egg. Hermione held the empty shell of moonstone in both hands and felt the spring air change quality around her. Not warmer, but denser, as though the atmosphere itself had drawn one long breath and not yet let it go, and looked back at Draco Malfoy across the garden, and knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, that something had already begun. She was not entirely sure it hadn't begun long before this. The shell was still warm. She should have put it down. She was aware of this, the same way she was aware, distantly, that her clipboard was still tucked under her left arm, and that 3 separate guests had glanced in her direction in the last 30 seconds, and that the boy in the green robes was now engaged in a spirited argument with a garden hedge. She was aware of all of it. She simply couldn't move. The moonstone casing sat in her palms like something that had always been there, like an object that had spent years in her possession, and only now, in this specific moment of spring light and hyacinth smell and impossible clarity, decided to make itself known. The carved hawthorn vines pressed their delicate relief into her skin. Her hands had stopped being cold. She made herself look down at it, made herself perform the clinical assessment she had read 4 texts to prepare for. Wish eggs, the oldest sources agreed, did not create. They recognized. The magic was sympathetic. It didn't introduce new material, but worked with what was already present. the way a catalyst functions in potion making. Not the source of the reaction, but the thing that allows the reaction to occur. What the egg opened in you, the text said with consistent and somewhat unsettling certainty, was already yours. Which was a fine theoretical framework, she thought, and completely useless to her now. Because what she was currently experiencing, this odd, hyper-present awareness, this sense of the air having acquired a new texture, wasn't an emotion she could name. It wasn't happiness or sadness, or the particular bittersweet register she'd become accustomed to in the year since the war. It was something more like orientation, a compass needle settling, a before and after with the dividing line running directly through the last 60 seconds. She became aware that she was still looking at Draco Malfoy. He had not moved. He stood at the edge of the topiary garden with his hands out of his pockets now. She noticed this as a departure, the way you notice any small break in a pattern you've been unconsciously tracking. And he was watching her with an expression that had no name in her existing vocabulary for him. She had many such vocabularies. She had built them carefully, defensively, over years. The cold contempt vocabulary, the performative boredom vocabulary, the particular sharp register he used when he wanted to wound something specific and knew exactly which angle to approach from. This was none of those. She looked away first because she was Hermione Granger, and she did not stand in gardens staring at Draco Malfoy in front of 40 charity guests. And she tucked the moonstone shell into the inner pocket of her robes, where it sat against her ribs with that particular warmth that was not quite temperature. And she turned back to her clipboard. The clipboard had a list on it. She focused on the list. Item 14. Confirm egg distribution coverage in East Garden. She had not confirmed this. She would confirm this now. This was a concrete task with a confirmable outcome, and it would take her to the East Garden, which was in the opposite direction from the topiary hares. She walked. The gravel was loud under her feet. The floating lights had migrated outward from the hall into the garden as the day warmed, and they moved between the guests like something with intent. And she moved between them too, nodding at the faces she recognized, smiling at the children, being exactly as present and organized as the day required. Her chest hummed. That was the only word for it. Not ached, not burned. Hummed, the way a string hums after you've plucked it, that sustained vibration that slowly fills the air around it. She pressed the clipboard harder against her ribs, inadvertently pressing it against the eggshell in her inner pocket, and the hum deepened fractionally and then steadied, and she kept walking. East Garden. Eggs. Confirmation. List. She found 4 eggs still unclaimed in the East Garden, 1 in the wisteria, 2 in the stone window casements, 1 balanced with improbable precision in the fork of an old apple tree. She noted them on her chart. She did not think about the moonstone casing against her ribs. She thought about it constantly. What she could not account for, what resisted her most determined attempts at systematic analysis, was the directionality of it. The hum wasn't uniform. It had a quality, a lean, like a plant growing toward a light source. She became aware of this when she reached the northeast corner of the East Garden, and the quality changed, sharpened, shifted from ambient to specific. And she turned, not because she meant to, but because her body completed the motion before she'd authorized it. Draco Malfoy was 20 feet away, examining an egg he'd apparently found in the apple tree's uppermost branch. He had his back to her. He was holding the egg with a carefulness that seemed at odds with his usual economy of expression. Both hands, she noticed, the way you hold something you know to be fragile. The afternoon light was doing something to his hair that she had no interest in cataloguing. She catalogued it anyway, against her better judgment. Against, frankly, her entire character. He turned, as though he'd felt the weight of her attention. "East Garden," he said, not a question. Confirming coverage. She held up the clipboard as evidence. "There are still 4 unclaimed eggs. I was noting their positions." "Were you?" "I was." She kept her voice at its most precise administrative register, the tone that meant, "This is a logistical conversation, and I am a logistical person, and we are not having any other kind of conversation at all." "Are you enjoying the hunt?" Something moved through his expression. Brief, not quite amusement, not quite its opposite. "I was looking at the tree." "You found an egg in it." "I found the egg that was already mine," he said, with a particular quiet that caught her off guard. He held it out slightly. She could see it now, a pale blue alabaster, elongated with a silver seam running its circumference, and then drew it back, almost immediately, as though he'd extended the gesture by accident. "The self-directing ones find you eventually, if you stay still long enough." She thought. I did not stay still. She thought. Mine found me anyway. She thought. Stop. "I should check the south alcoves," she said. "Granger." She stopped. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one without a name, and his jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was deciding something, weighing the cost of a word against the cost of silence. And she had learned this about him not from closeness, but from years of watching him across classrooms and corridors, and a great hall that had witnessed both the worst and best of what they were all capable of. "The egg you opened," he said. "How does it feel?" The question was so precisely not what she'd been braced for that she answered it honestly before her internal editor intervened. "Like a compass," she said. "That's found north." Something in his face went very still. "Right," he said after a moment. "That's, yes." He looked down at the blue alabaster egg in his own hands. "That's consistent with the older sources." "I've read the older sources." "I know you have." Another pause. The apple tree above them moved in the light spring wind, and blossoms fell, 3 of them, white, drifting, and landed in her hair and on his shoulder and on the space of gravel between them. Neither of them moved to brush them away. "I should," she began. "The south alcoves," he said. "Yes." She walked away. She felt him watching her until she turned the corner of the east wall, and she did not look back, and her chest hummed all the way to the south alcoves and all the way back, and the moonstone shell sat against her ribs like something that had decided, quite independently of her, that it was home. The afternoon moved in the way that well-organized events move, which is to say, it moved the way a river moves when the banks are properly maintained, with apparent smoothness that conceals the considerable force required to keep it there. Hermione was the bank. She had been the bank at 17 events this year. She was extremely good at it. She was also, today, experiencing the specific disorientation of a person who has had something fundamental shifted in them without their consent, and who is attempting to perform perfect competence over the top of it, which is the most exhausting kind of competence there is. The awareness followed her. This was the part she couldn't explain away, the part that resisted even her most rigorously constructed alternative theories. She was 3 conversations into a very sensible discussion with the fund's chief coordinator about table arrangements for the lunch, when she felt the quality of the air change, that particular atmospheric pressure, like a weather shift before you can see the clouds, and knew, with the same pre-rational certainty as before, that he had come back inside. She didn't look up from the table plan. She heard him speak to someone near the hall entrance, brief, polite, the social register he used for people he was managing rather than engaging. And then the air changed again, differently, and she knew he had looked in her direction without looking up from the table plan. She looked up from the table plan. He was indeed looking at her across the hall, and he had indeed arranged his expression back into its neutral configuration, and the arrangement was very nearly perfect. But there was something at the line of his throat, a tightness, a held quality, a fractional elevation of pulse visible at the jaw, that the neutral expression didn't quite extend to cover. She looked back at the table plan. "The east arrangement is fine," she told the coordinator. "Leave the west as it is. The acoustics in this room favor that configuration for the children's table." The coordinator nodded and moved away, and Hermione stared at her chart and was aware of the exact number of feet between herself and Draco Malfoy, as though the distance were a measurement she'd taken. 32 feet. She did not take measurements of distances between herself and other people. She had never done this before in her life. She found it profoundly irritating. The moonstone shell in her pocket pulsed once, very gently, and she pressed her hand flat against her ribs from the outside and breathed through the sensation with the focused discipline of someone who has survived considerably worse, which she had, which didn't help as much as it should have. She found him again at the edge of the lunch gathering, and this time it was not the egg that led her there. Or not only the egg. She had a legitimate reason. She had thought of it specifically, constructed it carefully, verified that it was indeed a legitimate reason before she walked toward him. "The 38th Commission," she said when she reached him. The documentation listed the recipient designation as blank. "For our records, for the fund's records, we need some indication of the intended recipient." He turned from the garden view. He was always at the edge of things, she noticed, always positioned with some portion of the room's escape route visible, and looked at her with careful, measured attention. "For the records," he said. "Yes. An official inquiry. An administrative one." The corner of his mouth moved. "Put unknown," he said. "That's accurate enough. Unknown isn't a recipient." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her steadily. His hands were in his pockets again, and she could see the slight press of fabric at the knuckle line. Not tension exactly, but containment, the physical evidence of something being held very carefully in check. "How is the compass, Granger?" Her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "Functioning." "Pointing at anything specific?" The question arrived in the quiet between them and detonated there, softly, like something that had been counting down for some time and had simply run out of patience. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The floating lights moved between the lunch guests around them, sun on water, restless and alive, and the spring air smelled of rosemary and butter and hyacinth, and the moonstone shell in her inner pocket held its warmth against her ribs with steady, unreasonable conviction. "I haven't determined that yet," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him in years. Something shifted in his face, so quickly she almost missed it. A crack in the arrangement, there and gone like light through a briefly opened door. Then it was closed again, and he nodded once and turned back to his garden view, and she walked away toward the lunch tables with her clipboard and her list and her humming chest. Behind her, she was absolutely certain he did not look away until she was out of sight. The lunch was excellent. Hermione knew this because 3 separate guests told her so, and because the children's table had reached that particular pitch of noise that only occurs when small people are genuinely happy rather than performing happiness for the benefit of nearby adults. She knew it the way she knew most things about the afternoon, from the outside, at a slight remove, as though she were reading a very detailed account of an event she was also somehow attending in person. The compass did not rest during lunch. This was the part she hadn't anticipated, not the existence of it, which she was grudgingly learning to accept as a documented magical phenomenon, but the consistency of it. She had expected it to fade with distance, the way most enchantments attenuate when their source moves out of range. Instead, it maintained itself with the implacable steadiness of a true north bearing, and what it told her with the quiet authority of something that has no investment in being diplomatic, was that Draco Malfoy was sitting 14 feet to her left and slightly behind her at the far end of the secondary donor table, and had been there for 23 minutes. She had not looked once. She considered this a significant personal achievement. She ate her rosemary chicken. She answered a question from the woman to her right about the fund's winter program. She refilled her water glass. She performed lunch with the focused precision of someone diffusing something, one careful movement at a time, and the awareness sat in her chest and hummed and told her with unhelpful regularity exactly where he was. Then the woman to her right said something that required Hermione to turn her head to hear it properly. The acoustics at this end of the table were genuinely poor. She had noted this in her pre-event survey. And in turning, she turned too far, by perhaps 15 degrees more than necessary, and her gaze crossed the secondary donor table. He was looking at his plate. He was cutting something, methodically, without apparent interest in the food itself, and his attention was entirely directed downward, and there was nothing remarkable about this except that the line of his shoulders had that held quality again, that careful maintenance, and his knife moved with the precise economy of a person who is concentrating on a task in order to not concentrate on something else. She looked away. Her water glass was empty. She had just refilled it. She put it down. The afternoon program resumed at 2:30 with the second stage of the hunt, a guided component for the younger children, supervised by volunteers, which freed the adult guests to explore the estate's gardens with a map of remaining egg locations. Hermione had designed the map. She had cross-referenced it twice. She distributed copies at the garden entrance with the efficient pleasantness she'd been sustaining for 4 hours now, and felt, as the last guest took their map and moved into the grounds, the very specific exhaustion of sustained pleasantness beginning to make itself known in her back teeth. She kept her own copy of the map. She was supervising, she told herself. She needed to know the terrain. She had a legitimate professional reason to walk the grounds with a map of egg locations, and the fact that the compass in her chest had shifted its quality, sharpened the way it had in the East Garden that morning, was purely incidental and entirely irrelevant to her route. She took the west path. The west path ran along the estate's oldest wall, where the stone had gone that particular shade of grey-green that happens over centuries, and the wisteria that climbed it was just beginning to bloom. The purple not yet fully open, still more bud than flower, the whole wall holding its colour like a breath not quite released. The floating lights hadn't migrated this far. The afternoon sun came through at a low angle and made the path look like something from a painting, the light too golden, too deliberate, the kind of light that seemed to have an opinion about the scene it was illuminating. She found 2 unclaimed eggs in the wisteria. She noted them on her chart. She turned the corner into the long walk between the yew hedges, formal, clipped, the hedges reaching twice her height and cutting the sky into a long, pale rectangle overhead, and stopped. Draco was 10 feet ahead of her, facing away, apparently reading something on his own map. The compass, unhelpfully, registered a sensation she could only describe as satisfaction. She considered retreating. She considered it seriously for a full 2 seconds, and then discarded it on the grounds that retreating was not something she did, and that she had just as much right to the long walk as he did, and that she was, above all else, a professional adult attending a professional event in a professional capacity. She walked forward. He heard her. She saw the fractional shift in his posture, the small adjustment of someone who has registered a presence and decided how to receive it, and turned when she was close enough that turning had become the only graceful option. "Long walk," she said. "Observant," he said. She ignored this. "There should be 3 eggs in the yew hedge on the right side. The 4th century charm on the root system makes them difficult to locate without Granger." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression of faint, careful exasperation that was, she realized slowly, considerably more honest than anything he'd worn during lunch. "You've been avoiding me since the south alcoves. I've been running an event. For the last 40 minutes, you've been running an event in every direction that isn't mine." The accuracy of this was unfortunately complete. She straightened the already straight edge of her clipboard against her forearm. "I wasn't aware my directional choices required your commentary." "They don't," he said. "I'm not commenting. I'm observing. The distinction is subtle. I've always been subtle. Something in the delivery, the dry, flat edge of it, the microsecond before it, where she could see him decide to say it, caught her off guard, and the laugh that came out of her was small and involuntary and gone almost immediately. But it happened, and she watched him register it with the careful attention of someone cataloguing something rare. His expression didn't change, but the set of his jaw did, fractionally, a release of something held. "The eggs," she said, recovering. "In the yew hedge. The detection method for 4th century concealment charms involves walking slowly and paying attention," he said. I know how to look for things. She believed this. Uncharitably, unhelpfully, she believed it entirely. They walked the yew hedge in a silence that was not comfortable. She would not have described it as comfortable, would have resisted that description strenuously, but which was not hostile either. It occupied a third category she didn't have a name for yet. A silence with texture, with the particular charged quality of two people who are both very aware of each other and very carefully not addressing it. He found the first egg. She found the second and third together, nested in the roots where the hedge met the path. The fourth took them both. He spotted the concealment shimmer first. She identified the specific discoloration in the bark that indicated the charm's anchor point, and they reached toward it at the same moment, and their hands didn't quite touch, and she pulled back as though the air between their fingers had become briefly insupportable. He took the egg from the hedge. She noted it on her chart. They stood in the long corridor of yew and sky, and the autumn gold afternoon light reached the far end and made a rectangle of warmth at the hedgewalk's exit, and she stared at it because it gave her somewhere to look that wasn't him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. It came out less like a question than a statement of intent. She heard the absence of inflection in it and recognized it as the tone she used when she was going to ask the thing regardless of the answer. "You will, regardless," he said, not unkindly. "The egg this morning, the self-directing ones, you said they find you if you stay still, but you said it about your own egg, the blue one." She turned the clipboard over in her hands, a tick she recognized and couldn't stop. "The 38th, the one with the blank recipient. You commissioned a self-directing egg with no designated recipient and brought it to an event where—" She stopped, reorganized. Who was it meant to find? The silence that followed had a different quality from the walking silence. Denser. She could feel him deciding something behind it, the same weighing process she'd observed at the lunch table. Cost of speaking against cost of silence, measured with the precision of someone who has made that calculation so many times it has become involuntary. "I had a theory," he said, "about the old magic. Whether it would respond in the right conditions. Respond to what? To something true." He said it with a quietness that had a hard center to it, like fruit that looks soft and isn't. The wish egg literature, which you've read, distinguishes between manufactured feeling and genuine feeling. The old magic doesn't amplify performance. It doesn't respond to what you present, only to what's actually there. She was very still. "So, you commissioned an egg," she said carefully, "to test whether something genuine existed in the right person." "I commissioned an egg," he said, "to test whether something genuine existed," without specifying the person, because that would have a pause. His hand turned the blue alabaster egg over once. That would have been a different kind of magic, a worse kind. She understood this and wished she didn't, because understanding it meant accepting what it implied, and what it implied was that he had created a condition for truth rather than a mechanism for control. And the difference between those two things was so significant and so unexpected from him that it made the compass in her chest swing with a force that was nearly physical. "That's—" She stopped, tried again. "That's an unusual methodology." The corner of his mouth moved. "Coming from you, That's either a compliment or an indictment. I haven't decided yet. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The yew hedge rustled in a wind she couldn't feel from inside its corridor, and somewhere beyond the west wall, a child shouted with a pure, uncomplicated triumph of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. "Your compass," he said. "Is it still pointing?" Her chest hummed. The moonstone shell against her ribs held its warmth with quiet, intractable insistence. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd received information he intended to think about privately and at length. And she recognized this too, and the recognition felt like something being added to an already precarious balance. "There are supposed to be eggs in the south garden," he said, "along the old sundial walk." "3 of them," she confirmed. "4th century concealment again." "Then we should—" He gestured loosely toward the far end of the yew walk and the gold-lit rectangle of open garden beyond it. She looked at the rectangle of light. She looked at her chart. She looked, briefly, at the blue alabaster egg he was turning over in his left hand with that careful, unconscious rhythm. "We should," she agreed. They walked toward the light together, and the silence between them had shifted again, had found a new configuration, warmer and more precarious, like something that has been set down gently and isn't quite sure of the surface yet. She didn't name it. She was running out of reasons not to, and that was precisely why she wouldn't. Not yet. The sundial garden opened before them, full of afternoon and the scent of early roses and the distant, happy noise of children who had already found everything they'd been looking for. And she walked into it with the compass steady in her chest, pointing with unambiguous, patient certainty at the man walking beside her. She noted 3 eggs on her chart. She did not note the other thing. She would deal with that later, she told herself. Later kept getting closer. The sundial was older than the estate. Hermione knew this from the survey notes she'd requested before the event. Thorough notes, 12 pages, because she didn't accept properties for charitable use without understanding what she was accepting. And the sundial had been listed as pre-1600, origin uncertain, enchantment status unknown, which was the kind of entry that made most event coordinators nervous and made her want to spend an afternoon in the archives. It stood at the garden centre on a plinth of darker stone, and the gnomon cast a shadow that didn't quite correspond to the actual position of the sun. She had noticed this immediately upon arriving this morning, and had noted it as a minor magical irregularity and set it aside. Standing beside it now, with the afternoon light doing its low-angled, opinionated work across the garden, she noticed it again. The shadow pointing slightly east of where it should, steady and certain, and entirely unconcerned with astronomical accuracy. Pointing, she thought, at something it had decided was more important than the sun. She made herself stop thinking in metaphors and consulted her chart. 2 along the left border, she said. 1 near the far wall behind the rosebed. The concealment anchor on the far one will be in the mortar, not the stone itself. The charm signature shifts in older walls when the binding agent. Granger. She looked up. Draco was watching her with that expression she was accumulating a vocabulary for, slowly and against her will. It was the expression of someone listening to music they recognize from a long time ago. Something in it careful, something in it unwilling, something beneath both of those things that had no performance in it at all. "You don't have to explain the concealment architecture to me," he said. "I know that." "Then why?" He stopped. Something shifted in his jaw. "You do it when you're uncomfortable." The accuracy of this produced a brief internal freefall that she arrested by the practiced method of saying the next true thing before she could calculate its cost. "I do it when I want to be talking about something other than what I'm actually thinking about." A pause. "And what are you actually thinking about?" The sundial shadow held its wrong angle. Somewhere in the rosebed, a bee moved with the unhurried industry of a creature that has no interest in the ambient emotional tension of nearby humans. The garden smelled of early roses and turned earth, and the faint mineral undertone of old stone. And the compass in her chest was so steady it had stopped feeling like a sensation and started feeling like a structural feature. "The egg," she said. He said nothing, which was, she was learning, its own form of answer. "You said the old magic responds only to what's genuinely present," she said, "not to what's performed." She turned the clipboard over once, stopped herself, set it down on the sundial plinth because she was tired of watching her own hands do that. "That means everything I've been, the way I've been aware of you today, is yours," he said, quietly. "Yes, that's..." She pressed her lips together. "That's a significant thing to be told." "I know," without being asked. Something tightened in his expression. Not defensiveness, she realized slowly. Something closer to the expression of a person waiting to hear a verdict they know is just, whatever it is. "I know that too." She looked at him. He stood with his hands at his sides, not in his pockets, she noticed, not tucked away, and the afternoon light made the angles of his face less severe. Or perhaps she was simply looking at them differently now, which amounted to the same thing and was considerably more alarming. "Why?" she asked, not aggressively. She genuinely wanted to understand the architecture of it. "If you wanted to know whether something genuine existed, you could have simply..." She stopped because the end of that sentence was "talk to me," and the absurdity of it, given the full history of what existed between them, closed her throat on a sound she converted at the last moment into a breath. He heard it anyway. She could tell from the way his focus sharpened. "Could I have?" he said. "No," she admitted. "No, probably not. There are 7 years of reasons why not." He said it without inflection, not bitterly, not as accusation, just as a fact laid on the table between them, the way you set down something heavy when your arms have been holding it long enough. "And a war, and everything after the war, which has its own..." He stopped. His thumb moved across the surface of the blue alabaster egg in his hand, a small, unconscious motion. "I needed to know if it was real without making it. A negotiation, without it being something you agreed to because of what I said, rather than what you actually..." He stopped again, his jaw set. "The egg doesn't care what either of us says. It responds to what's there." She was quiet for a long moment. The bee moved through the rosebed. The sundial shadow held its eastward lean. A child's voice, distant, rose and fell on the spring air. "That's either very logical," she said, "or very cowardly." She watched him take the word, watched him not flinch from it, which was its own form of answer. Probably both, he said. She picked her clipboard back up, not to use it, just to have something in her hands while she thought, which was a different kind of tick, and she was aware of it. The egg near the far wall, she said. The mortar charm. I should verify it's still. Granger. His voice had changed. Lower, the social register entirely gone. Not intimate exactly, but direct in a way that social register exists specifically to prevent. You can walk away from this conversation. I'm not going to... He stopped. His hand, she noticed, had closed fully around the blue egg. I'm not asking you for anything. I know you're not, she said. Then why are you still here? She looked at him. The question sat between them in the rose-scented air, simple and devastating, and she had approximately 4 accurate answers to it, and no intention of giving any of them. The eggs, she said. 3 of them, still unclaimed. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the answer warranted, and she held his, and then he turned toward the left border of the garden and began looking for the first one. She stood at the sundial and watched him for 3 seconds, allowed herself exactly 3, which was 2 more than she should have, and then followed. They found the first 2 quickly, efficiently, with the wordless coordination of people who are paying attention to the same thing and don't need to negotiate about it. He located the charm shimmer. She identified the anchor points. The eggs emerged from their concealment without resistance, as though they'd been waiting to be found by the right hands. The third one refused. The far wall was old, older than the sundial possibly. The mortar between the stones a different color than the stone itself, darker, almost organic. The egg was there. She could feel its presence the same way she'd been feeling all presences today. That atmospheric shift that meant something was occupying a space nearby. But the charm was layered, older than anything the available literature had prepared her for. And the anchor wasn't simply in the mortar. It was distributed across 3 points in a triangular configuration, and finding all 3 simultaneously required. Here, Draco said, from close behind her. He was pointing past her left shoulder at the 3rd anchor point, the one she'd been trying to locate for the last 2 minutes, and his arm was almost alongside hers, not touching, the warmth of proximity rather than contact. She found all 3 anchor points, pressed her intention against the charm structure, not a spell, just attention, focused and sustained, the old magic requiring old methods. The egg released. She caught it, small this one, dark green glass with a copper wire spiral at one end, and turned to record it on her chart, and found that turning brought her considerably closer to him than she'd calculated, because he had been closer than she'd realized, and for a suspended, graceless moment, they were at a proximity that required one of them to step back. Neither of them stepped back. She could see the fine grain of his skin in the afternoon light, the particular silver grey of his eyes that she now realized, been describing to herself inaccurately for years. Not cold, not the flat metallic grey she'd used in her internal vocabulary, but stratified, the way deep water is stratified, different depths showing different colours depending on the angle. She was close enough to see that his breathing had changed. Hers had too. She was aware of this with the clinical detachment of someone observing the phenomenon from outside her own body, which was where she would have preferred to be observing it from. "Found," she said. Her voice came out at the correct pitch, and she considered this a personal triumph. "Found," he agreed. His voice was somewhat lower than usual. She took the step back. It cost something. A small, distinct, measurable something, like a subtraction from a sum she hadn't known she was keeping. He turned and moved back toward the sundial, and she followed, and the garden held its afternoon light around them like a considered thing. It was the walk back to the hall that undid the careful equilibrium she'd rebuilt since the wall. It should have been neutral territory. The long gravel path from the south garden, other guests visible ahead, the event sounds resuming their normal registers around them. There was no particular reason for the air between them to carry any more charge than it had in the east garden, or the yew walk, or the rosebed at the wall. But he said, quietly, without preamble, as they walked, "You were right. Earlier. Logical and cowardly, both." She kept walking. Her clipboard was under her arm. The gravel was precise and loud beneath her feet. "I ordered the egg," he said, "because I needed a truth I couldn't argue with, couldn't dismiss. Something I couldn't decide afterward was projection or a mistake, or the specific kind of delusion you develop when you've spent a year trying not to think about something and thought about it anyway." She counted gravel steps. She was not going to respond to this on a gravel path with the east garden wall still visible and the event half ongoing around them. "Granger." She stopped. He stopped too, half a step ahead, and turned to look at her with the direct, unmediated quality that appeared, she had noticed, only when he had run out of the energy required to manage it into something safer. "I thought about it anyway," he said, "extensively, for a considerable amount of time. I'm aware of what it is and what it isn't, and I'm not asking you to." He stopped, the thumb moving over the blue egg again, that small unconscious motion. "I just wanted you to know the truth of it, without negotiation. That's all." She looked at him. The sun had moved in the time they'd been in the garden, and the light now came from a lower angle, and it did that thing to his hair again that she had no interest in cataloguing. "How long?" she said. Her voice was very even. "Extensively. How long is that?" A pause. Something moved through his expression that she thought might be the closest thing to vulnerable she had ever seen on his face. Brief, unguarded, there and gone. "Long enough," he said, "that I stopped being surprised by it." The gravel path held them both. The event sounds moved around them like water around two stones. The compass in her chest swung with a slow, certain force, and she let it. For one unguarded moment, she simply let it point where it was pointing, and didn't reach for the clipboard or the chart or the administrative register or any of the other things she used to stand between herself and what she actually felt. Then a child's voice called her name from the direction of the hall. High, urgent, the voice of someone who has found an egg they can't open and requires immediate adult assistance. And the moment folded back into the afternoon. "I should," she said. "Go," he said. "Yes." She went. The compass turned as she walked, following him without her permission, and she didn't look back, and the green glass egg was still in her left hand, copper wire spiral pressing its small mark into her palm, and she carried it all the way back to the hall without putting it down. He found the receipt at 3:15. It had been in his inner breast pocket the entire day, folded once, cream paper, the same stock as the donor card he'd left on Hermione's table that morning. And he found it when he reached for his wand to redirect a child who had wandered into the restricted East Wing and was attempting, with remarkable confidence, to open a door that had been sealed since the 17th century. He redirected the child. He stood in the East Corridor with the receipt in his hand and read it in the particular flat light that old houses produce in their interior passages, where the afternoon never quite reaches and the air holds the temperature of 3 seasons ago. Commission confirmed. 1, Wish Egg, Moonstone, Hawthorne design, self-directing enchantment, old classification, no recipient designation. Donor, D. Malfoy. Purpose, sympathetic resonance test. He had written sympathetic resonance test on the commission form because the alternative, writing what it actually was, had been inadmissible. Not to the craftsman, not to himself. He had sat with the form for 20 minutes before writing it and had then written it quickly, the way you do something that has to be done before the part of you that knows better can intervene. He folded the receipt and put it back. The thing about the egg, the thing he had not admitted to himself with full clarity until this particular corridor, in this particular light, with the receipt back in his pocket and a child's retreating footsteps echoing on old stone, was that he had not expected it to work. This was the part that sat in him now with a weight that had nothing comfortable about it. He had ordered the egg in February, in the specific grey exhaustion of a Tuesday when the post-war negotiations had ground through another session, and he had sat afterward in the Wizengamot antechamber and watched Hermione Granger walk past at the end of the corridor, not toward him, not aware of him, just moving with that purposeful, complete, thoroughly self-contained quality she had, as though she were a person who had never once required external orientation. And something in his chest had done what it always did, which was contract with a force entirely disproportionate to the stimulus. And he had thought, with considerable exasperation at himself, this has to stop, or it has to be true. He had ordered the egg because he needed to know which one it was. He had not expected it to find her. He had told himself, constructing the logic carefully over several weeks, that the self-directing enchantment would most likely settle on no one, or on some entirely unexpected recipient, one of the charity guests, one of the children, the event coordinator with her nervous energy and her clipboard, and that the result would be informative in a clean, conclusive way. The old magic would confirm what he had been trying to confirm for months, that what he felt was projection, residue, the specific psychological artifact of spending 7 years in adversarial proximity to someone whose mind operated at a frequency that had, apparently, permanently calibrated something in him. He had not expected the egg to cross 40 feet of garden and place itself in Hermione Granger's hands. He had not expected, when it did, to feel the thing in his chest stop contracting and simply open, like a room that has been kept shuttered for a very long time and someone has finally found the window. He stood in the East Corridor and looked at nothing in particular and allowed himself, for the duration of 3 breaths, to understand what this meant. Then he put it away. Not discarded. He had stopped discarding things. It didn't work. But placed carefully in the part of himself where things were held rather than avoided. the place he'd been slowly building since the war ended, and the luxury of avoidance had become something he could no longer afford. He went back to the party. She was at the east entrance when he emerged from the corridor, and the quality of her stillness when she saw him told him she had not expected to find him there. A fraction of a second, the time it took to compose the expression, to reassemble the professional surface. And then she was herself again, clipboard and precision, and that particular set to her jaw that meant she was thinking something she had not decided to share. He had catalogued this without meaning to. He had catalogued a great deal about her without meaning to, over years, the way you absorb the details of a landscape you pass through repeatedly, not studying it, just accumulating it, until one day you realize you know every contour by memory. "East wing," he said. "A child. It's handled." "I know," Sophie told me. She glanced down at her chart, a reflex. "Thank you." The words sat between them slightly oddly, the way gratitude between them always sat, neither of them entirely fluent in it, not with each other, too much history in the grammar. "The afternoon program," she said. "We're moving into the closing ceremony in about 40 minutes. There's a..." She stopped. Her free hand moved to the sleeve of her robe, adjusted it, smoothed the fabric along the forearm, put it down. "There's a traditional element, the final egg. There's always one that isn't hidden in the hunt. It's kept at the center of the main table, and at the closing ceremony, the donor who commissioned it presents it formally to the recipient." She met his eyes. "The self-directing ones are exempt from this, traditionally, but the coordinator has it on the program, and I need to know." "Granger." She stopped. He looked at her carefully. "What do you need to know?" She looked at her chart. She looked at the corridor. She looked briefly at the middle distance with the expression of someone performing a rapid internal calculation and not being entirely satisfied with any of the results. "Whether you want to be in the room for it," she said. "For the ceremony, given that the egg has already, given the circumstances." She straightened her sleeve again. "You don't have to be. I can note it as an anonymous commission. It would be unusual, but not unmanageable." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to not be in the room?" he asked. Her hand stopped moving on her sleeve. She looked up at him. "That's not the relevant question." "It seems relevant to me." Another pause. The east corridor held its flat, season-old air around them, and somewhere in the main hall the event sounds continued their self-sustaining life, and he watched her work through something behind her eyes, the visible labor of a person who is honest by nature and finds strategic evasion physically uncomfortable. "I don't know what I want yet," she said finally. The honesty of it was clearly costing her something. He could see the effort of not retreating from it, the slight forward set of her shoulders that meant she was holding her ground against herself. "That's the truth. I don't know what to do with what's happened today, and I don't..." She stopped. "I'm not ready to know, in front of 40 guests at a closing ceremony." He nodded. "I'll be in the garden." Something in her face shifted. Relief, he thought, and something underneath the relief that was more complicated, and that he chose carefully not to examine too closely. "Not yet." "Thank you," she said. Again. Still oddly, still without full fluency. But she meant it. He could tell from the fact that she didn't look away when she said it. He went to the garden. The topiary hairs were still suspended at the apex of their jump. He stood among them and thought about what she'd said. "I don't know what I want yet," and thought about the word "yet," which she had included, and which was not nothing. Hermione Granger did not include words accidentally. The closing ceremony lasted 22 minutes. He knew because he had a watch, and because he counted, not obsessively, but with the steady, involuntary attention of someone waiting for a specific moment without knowing what it will contain. Through the tall windows of the main hall, he could see the warm movement of people and floating light, could hear the rise and fall of the event's final register, the formal thank yous, the children's responses, the particular note of an occasion drawing itself to a close. He thought about February, the grey Tuesday and the Wizengamot corridor, and the moment of this has to stop or it has to be true. He thought about the egg crossing 40 feet of garden to find the correct pair of hands. He thought about what the old magic did and did not do, and what it meant that it had done what it did. She was standing at the garden doorway when he turned. He hadn't heard her approach. She moved quietly when she was thinking. He had noticed this, the inverse of her usual purposeful stride. She was in the doorway with the warm hall light behind her and the late afternoon in front of her, the event clearly concluded. He could hear the changed acoustics of a room being vacated, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before. Not the professional surface, not the careful neutrality, not the complicated, layered thing she'd worn in the sundial garden, which had cost her something to maintain. Just her face, just what was actually there. "It went well," he said. "The ceremony." "It went well," she agreed. She stepped out of the doorway and into the garden, and the door swung closed behind her, and the event sounds dimmed to near silence. The topiary hairs held their impossible suspension around them. The sky had shifted in the last hour, the gold of the afternoon going amber now, the first suggestion of evening at the horizon's edge. "I read the commission receipt," she said. He was still. "The coordinator had a copy in her files. She showed me during the ceremony. Administrative record," she said. She didn't know what it meant. Hermione's hands were at her sides, not holding the clipboard. He registered this, the absence of it, the deliberate not reaching. "It said sympathetic resonance test." He said nothing. "That's what you called it," she said. "On the form." "Yes." "Because you needed—" She stopped. He watched her decide to finish it. "Because you needed to know if what you felt was real, without it being a thing you could talk yourself out of afterward. Without it being conditional on what I said or what I didn't say." "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. The amber light was doing something to her face, softening the edges, or perhaps she was allowing that. He couldn't tell. "And now you know. And now I know." "What?" she said carefully. "Exactly do you know?" The question carried its full weight. He held it for a moment, the honest weight of it, the thing it was asking him to say without the protection of indirection or methodology or the useful distance of a commission form. "That it's real," he said. "That it has been for—" He stopped. His thumb was moving over the blue egg again, that compulsive motion. He made himself stop. "For long enough that I stopped being surprised by it. I told you that already." "You did," she said. I wanted to hear it again, without the gravel path and the retreating child. He looked at her. The topiary hairs suspended their endless leap around them, and the evening came slowly into the sky, and the garden held the last of its warmth against the coming cool. It's real, he said, simply, without the architecture of qualification. It's been real for a long time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her inner pocket and produced the moonstone shell, empty now, its enchantment spent, and held it in her palm between them. The carved hawthorn vines caught the amber light. The spell is spent, she said. What I'm feeling now? Her jaw set slightly, the effort of saying it clearly without hedging. What I feel right now has nothing to do with the egg. The egg is empty. He understood what she was telling him. Granger, he began. Long enough, she said. That's what you said. I want you to know that I understand what that means, because it's a breath, small, controlled, and not quite steady. It's accurate, for me as well. The amber light deepened. The garden was very still. He took one step toward her and stopped and looked at her face for the answer to the question he hadn't asked. And what he found there was not a surface, not a performance, not the careful professional composure she'd been sustaining for 7 hours. Just the truth of it, undefended. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who does nothing accidentally, and closed his hand around the moonstone shell in her palm. His fingers covered hers. The shell was between their hands, cool now, its warmth entirely spent. Neither of them moved. The evening settled into the garden around them like something that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this. She did not pull her hand away. This was the fact she kept returning to, later, when the evening had deepened, and the caterers were moving through the hall with the efficient quiet of people who understand their presence is peripheral, and she was standing at the main table pretending to review her closing notes, while the real thing, the actual, unmanageable thing, sat in her chest alongside the spent moonstone shell and refused to organize itself into anything she could work with. She had not pulled her hand away. She had stood in the topiary garden with his fingers closed over hers, and the amber light going slowly copper around them, and she had felt the warmth of his hand through the spent egg, the egg that had given its enchantment entirely, that held nothing now but the memory of what it had contained. And she had thought, with a clarity that bypassed every careful defense she had constructed, this is the realest thing that has happened to me today, which was significant given the day. She had been the one to step back eventually, gently, without drama, the way you set something down that you intend to pick up again, rather than the way you drop something to be rid of it. He had let her go without holding on, and this too was a fact she kept examining, turning it in her mind the way he turned the blue egg in his hands, looking for the thing she was supposed to feel about it. She had expected relief when the distance returned. She had expected the clinical clarity that usually followed the resolution of an overstimulated state. She had expected, honestly, the reaction she always had to moments of emotional exposure, the swift internal audit, the reassembling of proper perspective, the useful retroactive skepticism. None of those things came. What came instead was the quiet, intractable knowledge that she had been standing in the right place. She did not know what to do with that. You've checked those notes 3 times. She looked up. Ginny Weasley was leaning against the far end of the table with her arms crossed, and the expression she wore when she had been watching something for a while and had decided it was time to stop being a spectator. She was not supposed to be here. She had been invited and had said she couldn't come. Some prior commitment involving the Harpies and a scheduling conflict. And yet, here she was, in her everyday robes with her hair down, looking at Hermione with the focused attention of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is simply waiting for confirmation. "When did you arrive?" Hermione asked. "About an hour ago. I was at the back of the ceremony." Ginny moved along the table, picking up an unclaimed chocolate egg from the centerpiece and unwrapping it with the calm efficiency of someone who sees no reason to stand on ceremony about chocolate. "The coordinator let me in. I told her I was late." She took a bite. "You looked distracted during the closing remarks." "I was not distracted. I delivered the closing remarks." "You delivered them while thinking about something else. You do this thing with your left hand when you're somewhere else in your head. You straighten your cuff. You did it 4 times. Ginny looked at her with complete serenity. "Who were you thinking about?" Hermione set her notes down. The program ran 47 seconds over. I was recalculating. "Hermione." She looked at the notes. "He was in the garden during the ceremony," Ginny said. "Not an accusation, just a fact placed carefully. The topiary garden. I saw him from the window when I came in." A pause. "And then, after the ceremony, you went to the garden." "I needed to check the... Hermione." She stopped. The hall was quiet around them, the comfortable post-event quiet of a room winding down, the caterer's movements a steady background presence, the floating lights dimming gradually as the evening came. She could hear at the edges of the grounds the last of the guests departing, the sound of apparition carrying its small, sharp punctuation through the spring air. "Something happened today," she said. Ginny said nothing, which was the correct response. "It wasn't. I didn't plan it. There was an egg, one of the wishing eggs, a commissioned one, self-directing. I picked it up, and it..." She stopped. How to explain the compass to someone who hadn't felt it? How to explain the particular quality of the afternoon, the way the estate had seemed to narrow around 2 people and their accumulated unspoken history? "It opened for me." "The wishing eggs," Ginny said carefully. "Who commissioned it?" Silence. Ginny's eyes went very still. "Hermione." "It wasn't manipulation," she said, quickly. Too quickly the defense assembled before she'd fully decided she needed it. "The old magic doesn't work that way. It responds to what's genuinely present. It can't create something from nothing. It doesn't override." "Hermione." Ginny's voice was different now. Not sharp, not concerned, something more precise than either. "I know how the old magic works. My grandmother had a set of wish eggs. I know what they do and what they don't do." She set the chocolate down. "I'm asking you what happened." Hermione looked at her oldest friend. She thought about the receipt, sympathetic resonance test, and about his hands over hers in the copper light, and about the compass that had held its bearing all day and was, even now, providing her with the quiet, unhelpful information that he was somewhere in the northeast portion of the estate approximately 200 feet away. He needed to know if it was real, she said, without making it a negotiation, without it being conditional. She heard herself say it, and heard the way it sounded, heard the fairness of it, the specific, reluctant fairness she kept being ambushed by. The egg was supposed to find whoever it belonged to. He didn't designate a recipient. Ginny was very quiet for a moment. "And it found you," she said. "And it found me." Another pause. Ginny picked up the chocolate again, looked at it, put it back down. "How do you feel about that?" "I'm still determining." "That's not an answer. It's an accurate description of my current state." "Hermione." The gentleness in Ginny's voice was the particular gentleness of someone who cares enough to be direct. "How long have you been determining this?" The question found its mark precisely. She felt it arrive and settle and make itself at home in the silence between them. "A while," she said. "How long is a while?" She looked at the table. She looked at the closed moonstone shell in her inner pocket. She could feel it, cool and spent and weightless, the way you feel a ring on your finger that you're used to wearing. "Long enough," she said, "that I stopped being surprised by it." Ginny looked at her steadily. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise, Hermione realized. Not even quite relief. Something older than both of those. The expression of someone who has been watching a very long story and has just reached a chapter they recognized from a distance. "Okay," Ginny said. "That's all? Okay? What do you want me to say?" Ginny picked up the chocolate, finished it, folded the wrapper with economical precision. "You've just told me that a 7-year emotional impasse has potentially resolved itself via enchanted egg. I'm processing." Despite everything, Hermione felt the corner of her mouth pull upward. "It hasn't resolved," she said. We spoke. In the garden. He said..." She stopped. What he'd said in the garden was his, the specific and costly honesty of it, and she found she had no inclination to translate it for another person. "He was honest with me, in a way he didn't have to be." Was he? And I was honest back. Ginny looked at her for a long moment. What happens now? The question was exactly the right one, and she had no answer for it, which was exactly the problem. What happened now was the part that the egg's enchantment didn't cover, the part that the old magic left entirely to the people involved, which she was beginning to understand was simultaneously its greatest mercy and its most demanding requirement. "I don't know," she said honestly. She found him in the library. She hadn't been looking for him. She had been conducting a final walkthrough of the estate, which was a legitimate closing procedure and not, emphatically not, a structured search. The library was the last room on the west corridor, and she pushed open the door with the intent of confirming it had been properly cleared, and found Draco Malfoy standing at the window, with a book open in his hands that he was clearly not reading. He looked up when she entered. "Libraries on the walkthrough," she said. "I know." He closed the book. She saw the spine as he set it down. An herbology text, older than any current curriculum, the kind that stayed in old houses because no one remembered to remove them. I was waiting for the walkthrough, for whatever came after the walkthrough. She came into the room properly, letting the door fall closed behind her. The library had the particular quality of rooms that have held many hours of silence, the silence of books, accumulated and patient, a different texture from empty silence. The evening had arrived fully outside the window now, the last pale line of it at the horizon, the garden below in soft grey-blue shadow. The topiary hairs were barely visible, dark shapes against darker ground, their suspended leap invisible in the failing light. "Ginny was here," she said. "I saw her arrive." He paused. "How much did you tell her?" "Enough." She moved further into the room, to the table, to the chairs that flanked it, the comfortable academic geography of a space that gave her something to navigate. She didn't say much. She's perceptive enough not to need to." He nodded. She looked at the book he'd put down. "Were you actually reading?" "No." "What were you thinking about?" A pause. He turned from the window fully and looked at her across the library with the expression she'd accumulated a vocabulary for and was now understanding as simply his face when it had nothing performing over it. "February," he said. She had not expected him to answer that directly. "The Wizengamot corridor," she said. Something shifted. "You noticed?" "I notice most things," she said. "I didn't know what to do with that one." She sat down finally in one of the chairs, not with collapse, but with the deliberate decision of someone who has been standing for a long time and has decided to stop pretending it's unnecessary. "I walked past you and spent the next hour pretending I hadn't." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. The table between them held the old herbology book and a cold cup of tea that one of the caterers must have left. And in the window behind him, the last line of evening held on and went out. "Why?" he said, not aggressively, the same genuine inquiry she'd offered him in the sundial garden. Because acknowledging it required deciding what it meant. She held his gaze. "And I wasn't ready. I don't—" She stopped, restarted with more precision. "I don't do things I'm not ready for. I don't walk into situations without understanding them first. It's not a breath. It's not a virtue. I know that. It's fear with organizational skills applied to it." The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. "That's the most accurate description of a coping mechanism I've ever heard. I've had time to develop it. I've noticed." They sat across from each other in the library of a house that didn't belong to either of them, in the full dark of a spring evening, and the silence between them was the rarest kind. The kind that isn't waiting for anything, that isn't holding anything back, that has simply become the correct container for two people who have run out of reasons to be somewhere else. "The egg is empty," she said after a while. "I know you know that. The enchantment is spent. Whatever this is, right now, it's not the magic." "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I know," she said. "Because I need what happens, whatever happens, to be something I can stand behind, without being able to say the egg, without being able to say I wasn't thinking clearly." She straightened the edge of her robe along her knee, the last vestige of the clipboard tick applied to fabric. "I need to be choosing." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were on the table, not moving. Not the blue egg, not the book, not reaching for any intermediate object. Just still, present, the silver ring on his right hand, catching what little light the room still held. "Then choose," he said, quietly, without pressure, without leaning toward the answer. The word offered and then released, no strings on it. She looked at his hands on the table. She thought about February and the East Garden, and the yew walk, and the wall and the topiary garden in amber light. She thought about sympathetic resonance test, written on a form because the true words were inadmissible. She thought about long enough that I stopped being surprised by it, said on a gravel path in the late afternoon. She reached across the table. Her hand covered his, both of them, her palm over his knuckles, the silver ring pressing its small cold edge into her skin. And she felt him go very still beneath her touch, the particular stillness of someone absorbing something they had wanted for long enough that the reality of it requires a moment to locate. "I'm choosing," she said. Outside, the spring night settled fully into the garden. The topiary hares held their leap in the dark, suspended forever at the point of transformation, neither rising nor falling, simply held, at the apex of something. Beneath her hand, his turned over slowly, and his fingers closed around hers. The library held its accumulated silence around them and asked nothing more. She did not let go of his hand immediately. This was the detail she would return to later. Not the words, not the choosing, but the simple physical fact of not letting go. She had expected her own instincts to reassert themselves the moment the declaration was made, the way they always did. The swift internal audit, the automatic reassembly of appropriate distance, the reliable machinery of self-preservation clicking back into place. She had spent 26 years developing that machinery. It was, under normal circumstances, extremely efficient. His hand was warm. His fingers had closed around hers with the careful, contained pressure of someone who had decided not to hold too tightly. And the decision was visible in it. She could feel the restraint in it, the deliberate modulation, the choice to receive rather than grasp. And she sat across the library table in the full dark of a spring evening and felt the machinery of self-preservation idle. And then, with a quality she could only describe as exhaustion, go quiet. She was so tired of the machinery. She looked at their hands on the table. His were longer than hers. She noticed this as a new fact, though she had objectively known the dimensions of Draco Malfoy's hands for years, had observed them across classrooms and corridors and a war, had noted them holding wands and books and expensive glassware, and today, repeatedly, a small blue alabaster egg. But knowing a fact and experiencing it as real were different categories of knowledge, and what she was experiencing now was the second kind, immediate and specific. The particular geography of his knuckles under her palm, the silver ring pressing its edge into the soft skin between her fingers. "You're thinking very loudly," he said. "I'm always thinking." "I know." The quality of it. Not critical, not even particularly amused, just the tone of someone stating a truth they've carried for a long time. "I used to find it." He stopped. "Irritating?" she offered. I was going to say relentless. A pause, which I meant as a criticism for approximately the first 4 years. And then something shifted in how I meant it. She looked up from their hands. He was watching her with the direct, unmediated attention that appeared only when the energy required to manage it had been fully depleted. And she thought about 4 years. Their 4th year, specifically, the particular cruelty of him in that year. The word he'd used in the corridor that she had never fully metabolized, and had instead filed in the section of herself reserved for things that had happened and could not be changed. and felt the old flinch move through her, and was surprised, not for the first time today, by what came after it. Not anger, not the familiar fortifying hardness, something more complex. The recognition of a person who was someone else then, looking at the person he was now, and finding that the distance between those 2 points was not a reason to stop, but a thing to be reckoned with. "I need to say something," she said. His thumb was moving, very slightly, across the back of her hand. She didn't think he was aware of it. "4th year," she said. He went still. "And other times, there were specific moments where you chose to..." She organized it, the way she organized everything, finding the right architecture for what she needed to say. "I'm not bringing them as evidence against you. This isn't a prosecution. But I can't simply..." She stopped. "I need to know that you know what they were, that they're not things you've filed away and forgotten." The stillness in him had changed quality, not defensive. She watched for that, for the armoring up, the withdrawal into cold disdain that had historically been his response to being held accountable. It didn't come. What came instead was something considerably harder to look at. The expression of a person who has looked at specific things about themselves without flinching and found the looking insufficient, because looking doesn't repair anything. "I haven't forgotten any of them," he said. "The corridor, 3rd year, what you called me. I remember. And you know what it was. I know exactly what it was." His jaw set, not in anger, in the specific configuration of someone holding something that doesn't have a comfortable position. "I knew then. I said it because I knew it would land where it did, because I was..." A breath, controlled, but not easy. "Because I was 12 years old and already very practiced at finding the precise angle of attack, and because you frightened me in a way I had no vocabulary for." She was quiet. "That's not an excuse," he said. "I'm not offering it as one." "I know," she said. "I know the difference between an explanation and an excuse." She looked at their hands again. His thumb had stopped moving. "There were other moments." "Yes." "The war." "Yes." "You didn't..." She stopped. The memory had its own weather system, and she let it move through her and kept her voice steady. "In the manor, you didn't confirm it was me when they asked." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences of the evening. Denser. She felt him navigate it, felt the navigation in the pressure of his hand around hers, in the way his breathing changed almost imperceptibly. "No," he said. "I didn't. We never talked about that." "No. Why didn't you?" The question had waited a long time. She hadn't known she was going to ask it tonight, in this library, in the dark, with his hand holding hers across a table. But it was there now, asking itself, and she didn't call it back. He looked at her for a long moment. The last light from the window was entirely gone. The room was held now only in the dim ambient glow that old magical houses produce in the dark, something between phosphorescence and memory. The walls give her back what they'd absorbed over centuries. "Because I looked at you," he said, "and I couldn't." 3 words in the middle of the sentence, and the sentence ended. He didn't add to it, didn't construct the explanation further, didn't give it the architecture it might have needed to be safer. He left it as it was, a simple causality stripped of decoration. She believed him. This was the thing she was most surprised by, sitting in the library of the Vanthorpe estate in the dark. Not the words, but the fact that she believed them without deliberation, without the internal cross-examination she applied to most things. She believed him the way you believe something that has been true for a while and only recently been said aloud. That was a different kind of choice, she said. From today. Yes, but the same. She felt her way through it carefully. The same route, the same mechanism. He looked at her steadily. I believe so. Yes. She took a breath. Let it out. Her free hand moved to the moonstone shell in her inner pocket. Found it, held it there without removing it. The cool, inert weight of it, a kind of anchor. I have to tell you something too. He waited. When I walked past you in February, she said, in the corridor, I spent the next hour pretending I hadn't noticed you, and the hour after that telling myself I'd pretended successfully. She felt the slight absurdity of it, and let it be absurd, let it be what it was. I hadn't. The noticing has been. A pause. She chose precision over safety. Consistent, for a significant period of time. I kept filing it as a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be acknowledged, because acknowledging it required deciding what it meant, he said. Her own words returned to her. Yes. And now you've decided. I'm deciding, she said. The present tense deliberate. That's different. It's ongoing. I don't want to give you a conclusion I haven't fully reached. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. She looked at him directly. But the direction of it is clear. The direction has been clear for a while. I was simply refusing to look at the compass. Something moved through his expression, a complicated passage of things, none of them fully surfacing, the way weather moves through a landscape that has learned to absorb it. He nodded once, slowly, with the quality of someone receiving something and setting it carefully in the correct place. The compass, he said. Still pointing, she said. His hand around hers tightened, fractionally, the first real pressure of the evening. Not restraint this time, not modulation, just the involuntary physical expression of something that had nowhere else to go. They stayed in the library while the estate completed its closing around them. She was aware of this, the caterers departing, the lights dimming in sequence through the west corridor, the event coordinator's final rounds producing the hollow echo of organized footsteps on old stone. The sounds of an occasion finishing, the sounds of a space returning to itself after having been asked to hold something larger than its usual contents. At some point, she had moved from the chair to the window seat. She couldn't have said exactly when, only that it had happened in stages, the way things happen when no one is managing them, and he had followed, and they sat now in the window embrasure with the night garden below and the spent moonstone shell on the sill between them and the blue alabaster egg beside it. 2 eggs, she said. One that found you, he said. One that was already mine. What did yours tell you? He looked at the blue egg for a moment, that there was something worth testing for. He picked it up, turned it over once. That the intention was genuine. The wish eggs don't activate they don't respond to bad faith. The craftsman told me that. He said, if the intention behind the commission was manipulative, the egg simply wouldn't complete. It would stay sealed. She considered this. It completed. It completed. He set it back on the sill. Whatever I told myself about methodology and resonance testing, the magic knew what the question actually was. And what was the question? He looked at her. In the ambient glow of the old house, his face had lost all the daytime social architecture, all the careful arrangement. He looked, she thought, like someone who has been travelling for a very long time and has arrived somewhere and is still in the process of understanding that he can stop moving. Whether this was something I was allowed to want, he said. The simplicity of it reached her before she could prepare for it. She thought about the word allowed, what it meant in the architecture of his life, in the specific context of who he had been required to be, and what that had cost, and what the post-war world had and had not offered him by way of permission for ordinary human wanting. She thought about how long a person could maintain something, a feeling, a hope, a question held in suspension, when they genuinely didn't know whether they had the right to it. "You're allowed," she said. He looked at her. "I'm telling you," she said, with a precision she applied to things she meant completely. "You're allowed." The window held the dark garden. The moonstone shell and the blue egg sat between them on the sill, both spent, both empty, the enchantments fully given and gone. Whatever was in the room now was entirely theirs, unmixed, unassisted, the product of a day's accumulation and 7 years of prior history, and 2 people sitting in a window in the dark, deciding not to move. His hand found hers again, not across a table this time. Beside him on the window seat, a different proximity, closer, the warmth of his shoulder at the edge of her awareness. "Granger," he said. "Hermione," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. The word landing, the name, her actual name in his mouth, after years of the surname used as a kind of formal distance, even when the formality was pretense. "Hermione," he said, testing it, the sound of it careful and new, and she felt it move through her, the specific, unreasonable effect of her own name, said with that quality, that first-time quality, like something being uncovered rather than spoken. She looked at him in the dark of the old library and felt the compass, steady, patient, entirely unhurried, hold its bearing with the calm authority of something that has never been confused about this. Outside, the topiary hares suspended their eternal leap against the spring night. Inside, neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The night had fully arrived by the time the last caterer left. Hermione heard the final set of footsteps recede down the west corridor, purposeful, fading, the hollow diminuendo of departure. And then the estate went quiet in the particular way that large old houses go quiet when they are finally left to themselves. Not silence exactly, but the sound of a space exhaling, releasing the shape of the day it has been asked to hold. The walls gave back small sounds, the distant settlement of old timber, the whisper of wisteria against glass, the low, persuasive voice of wind finding its way through some gap in the stonework that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries more. She was aware of all of it with a sensory precision that had nothing to do with the egg. The egg was empty. The shell sat on the windowsill beside the blue alabaster, and neither of them had touched either object in the last hour. And she knew, with the same clarity that had been arriving all day in inconvenient increments, that what she felt in this room had nothing borrowed in it, no enchantment, No sympathetic resonance. Just the accumulated, unassisted truth of a very long time, finally finding a room quiet enough to be heard. Draco was beside her in the window embrasure, close enough that the warmth of his arm registered along the length of hers. And he was looking at the garden with an expression she had learned over the course of the day to read as thinking, not the performed consideration he used in public, not the deliberate blankness of managed emotion, but the actual interior variety, visible in the slight unfocus of his gaze and the way his breathing had slowed to something more fundamental than the social rate. She let him think. This was new, the willingness to simply sit beside someone and let them be where they were without requiring that the space be filled or managed. She was not, historically, good at unstructured silence. Silence was where the things she hadn't finished processing lived, and processing required language, required the organizing principle of thought made visible, and she had spent the better part of her life converting silence into something she could work with. But this particular silence had its own structure. She could feel it, the weight of it, the shape, the way it held what the day had deposited in both of them without demanding anything in return. She looked at the garden. The topiary hairs were dark suggestions in the dark, their frozen leap now entirely an act of faith. You had to know they were there to see them. "I keep thinking about the sundial," she said. He turned his head slightly. Not toward her exactly, just an adjustment of attention, a reorientation. "The shadow," she said. "It was pointing the wrong way all day. I kept noticing it and filing it as a minor irregularity and moving on." "Pre-1600, he said. "The enchantment on the plinth. It's a very old locating spell, the kind that redirects the shadow towards something the caster designated as significant. Whatever the original owner of this estate considered most worth finding." A pause. "It's been pointing east since I arrived this morning." She thought about the east garden, the apple tree, the moment their hands had almost touched, reaching for the egg in the hedge roots. "That's either a remarkable coincidence," she said, "or the estate has very specific opinions." "Old houses develop preferences," he said. The dry flatness of it, the microsecond before it where she could see him decide to say it, the delivery so precisely calibrated. And she laughed, properly this time, not the small involuntary sound from the yew hedge, but something fuller, something that came from lower down and surprised her slightly with its own sincerity. He turned to look at her when she laughed. She felt him looking and let it happen. Didn't redirect, didn't find something neutral to examine. Just met his eyes in the window's ambient dark and held the contact with the steady, slightly terrifying openness of someone who has decided to stop managing what their face shows. He looked at her as though she was something he was learning the geography of. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at the garden, but something had changed in the line of his shoulders. A release, almost imperceptible, the kind of shift that only registers because you've been paying attention to the held quality that preceded it. "I was nothing." "You were going to say something." "I decided not to." "Why?" A pause. "Because I've said enough tonight that required courage, and I'm rationing." She felt the corner of her mouth pull. "You said 3 things." "4. 4 things over the course of 8 hours is not an excessive expenditure." "For me, it is." She considered this. It was, she recognized, entirely true. Not as weakness, not as deficiency, but as the specific economy of a person who had learned early that words were instruments of consequence and had therefore developed a relationship with them that prioritized precision over volume. She had always mistaken this for coldness. She was no longer making that mistake. "Tell me the thing you decided not to say," she said. He looked at the garden for a long moment. His thumb was not moving over the blue egg. His hands were still, both of them, resting on his knee with that uncharacteristic openness that had appeared sometime in the last 2 hours and not retreated. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that I've been looking at you for a significant portion of my life, in various capacities and from various distances, and I've never—" He stopped, tried a different entry point. "You laughed just now, and I realized I couldn't remember ever having heard that before. That specific version of it." She was quiet. "I've heard you laugh in meetings," he said. "I've heard the polite version, the professional version, and I've heard, once, across the atrium in November, you laughed at something Weasley said, and it was—" His jaw moved slightly. "But not at something I said. Not with me." He looked at her. "I found I wanted more of it." The library held them both. The old walls gave back their small sounds. She felt something move through her chest. Not the compass, not the residual warmth of spent enchantment, but something more fundamental than either. The specific and ungovernable sensation of being seen clearly by someone you have also, without quite admitting it, been seeing. "You're allowed to want that too," she said. He held her gaze. "I'm aware. You told me. I'm reminding you." Something in his expression shifted. The last layer of it, the final maintained configuration, simply released. Not dramatically. Not with the visible effort of something being forced open. It released the way a held breath releases, inevitably, with relief, with the slight wonderment of a body that has forgotten how to not be braced. She reached up without thinking about it, or thinking about it exactly as much as she thought about breathing, which was not at all, and touched his face. Her fingers found the line of his jaw, the specific angle of it she had observed from across rooms for years, and was now learning from 3 inches. His skin was warm. She could feel the slight tension in the muscle beneath her palm. Not resistance, she understood immediately, but the same quality she'd felt in his hand in the topiary garden, the careful not holding too tight, the deliberate restraint of someone receiving something they intend to be careful with. He didn't move. She didn't move. They held that stillness together, her hand against his face and his eyes on hers, and the old house breathing its centuries around them, and the night garden beyond the glass holding its frozen hairs in their forever leap. And she felt the compass settle with a finality that was nothing like the ending of things. Exactly the opposite, actually. The feeling of an instrument that has been searching for its bearing and has found it and is now, for the first time, simply resting. "Draco," she said. His name, his actual name, in her voice, offered without the armor of the surname she'd been using since they were 11 years old. He closed his eyes briefly, the way people close their eyes against something that is too immediate for normal processing, then opened them. "Yes," he said, quietly, not answering a question, just affirming something. the existence of this, the reality of her hand and his face, and the space between them that was no longer the cautious diplomatic distance of two people managing their history, but something else entirely, something that had no defensive function, something that simply was. She leaned forward, not quickly, slowly, with the considered deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is enacting it fully, without the hedging velocity of impulse. She felt him understand what was happening, felt it in the slight intake of breath, in the fractional movement toward her that he arrested almost immediately, waiting, giving her the full space of the choice. She closed the distance. His mouth was warm and careful, and then, when she didn't pull back, less careful, not reckless, never reckless, but present, fully present, the restraint releasing by degrees in the way the rest of him had been releasing across the whole length of this day. His hand came up and found her face the way she'd found his, the same instinct, the same geography being learned from proximity after years of distance. And she felt his fingers at her jaw, at the line of her cheekbone, with that quality of careful, not too tight, that was the most distinctly him thing she had experienced today. This deliberate decision not to grasp what he was afraid of losing. She thought, briefly, and with the particular clarity of someone whose mind never fully stops. I have been ridiculous for a very long time. And then she stopped thinking entirely, which was extraordinary, and let the night and the old house and the spring garden full of frozen hares and the spent shells of 2 enchanted eggs hold whatever this was, whatever it had become over the course of one impossible Easter afternoon. When they separated, it was not dramatically. She rested her forehead against his, briefly, and felt his exhale against her mouth, and thought that this specific interval, the closeness after, the unhurried continuation of proximity, was something she hadn't been prepared for, but felt, instinctively, was its own essential component. Not aftermath, not conclusion, just the natural extension of the same thing, the breath that follows a sentence and is part of the meaning. "The notes I was reviewing," she said after a while. "During the closing ceremony, I wasn't recalculating the program timing." She felt his face change against her forehead, the slight shift of expression, the almost smile she'd been cataloguing all day. "I know," he said. "I was thinking about the sundial garden, the wall, the way our hands nearly in the hedge roots." She pulled back enough to look at him. "I was constructing arguments for why the egg was sufficient explanation for all of it. I was working very hard." "How was the work going?" "Badly," she said. "The arguments kept failing the basic logical tests. The enchantment was sympathetic, not generative. My own notes from the literature kept refuting my conclusions." "Devastating," he said, "to be undone by your own scholarship." The laugh came again, that fuller version, the one he'd said he wanted more of, and she watched something happen in his face when it did, something uncomplicated and real, the expression of a person receiving something they'd wanted, without being sure they'd get it. She would give him that, she thought, that specifically, as many times and in as many rooms as circumstances allowed. "The hares," she said, nodding toward the window. "In the morning they looked suspended, wrong, like something caught between 2 states." He looked at the dark garden. "And now?" She considered them, the dark shapes at the top of their dark arc, the frozen leap that had bothered her all day with its incompleteness, its in-between quality. "Now they look like they're flying," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the right word. You said so this morning. You remembered." "I remember everything," she said. "It's occasionally a burden. Today, it wasn't." He looked at her with the unmediated directness that was. She was beginning to understand, not a departure from his usual expression, but the original, the face underneath the arrangements, the thing all the careful management had been constructed to protect. She had seen it in pieces across the day, surfacing and retreating. She was seeing it whole now, and it was not what she would have predicted, not harder, more open somehow than the managed version, more available. She thought about availability, about what it required and what it cost, about the specific courage of a person who has learned, through significant evidence, that openness is dangerous, deciding to be open anyway. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. Not with the anxious inflection of someone who needs the answer in order to proceed, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who has accepted that tomorrow is a real place they will actually reach. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him considering it, not with the old wariness, the cost-benefit calculation she'd watched him run all day, but with something different, something more like the small blue egg, turning it over in his mind for what it actually was, rather than what he'd been telling himself. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, "I think I would like to have coffee with you, if that's something you'd consider." The ordinariness of it, the specific, deliberate ordinariness, the choice of the smallest possible next thing, made her chest do something she was going to need time to fully categorize. "That," she said, "is something I'd consider." "Good." He looked at the garden. "There's a place near the ministry. It opens early. The coffee is unremarkable, but the window is good. It looks onto a courtyard. In the morning, it gets the first light." He had thought about this, she realized. Not tonight. Before tonight. The specific detail of the window, the morning light. He had constructed the image at some point and held it. "That sounds," she said, "exactly right." He turned from the garden and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the library held its patient silence around two people who had arrived, by a long and circuitous route involving 7 years of history, and a war, and a February corridor, and a moonstone egg, and one impossible Easter afternoon at the beginning of something. She picked up the moonstone shell from the sill, turned it in her fingers, the carved hawthorn vines, the cool, smooth surface, the weight of it so slight it was barely there. "The craftsman," she said. "The one who made this. Did he tell you anything else? About what happens after?" Draco looked at the shell in her hands. "He said the old eggs, when the enchantment is spent, they don't disappear. The magic does, but the object stays. He said people keep them." A pause. "He said they're useful to have. A record of what was true at a specific moment. Something you can hold and know. This was real. This happened. I have evidence." She closed her fingers around the empty shell. Evidence. A record. Something to hold against the moments. And there would be moments. She was not naive about this. There would be the full, complicated work of two people with their specific histories finding their way through ordinary time, when the certainty required anchoring. She put the shell in her pocket. "Shall we go?" she said. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it, not the provisional object-mediated contact of the sundial garden, or the table, or the windowsill, but simply his hand, direct and warm. And she held it with a steady, unpretentious grip of someone who has decided where she is and has no immediate plans to be somewhere else. They walked out of the library and through the quiet west corridor and into the entrance hall where the floating lights had dimmed to their last ember glow. And she paused at the main door to look back once. The velvet case, empty now, all 38 eggs found and opened and given and gone. And the hall that had held the day's entire weight and was now, finally, just a hall. 38, she said. 38, he agreed. She turned back to the door. He pushed it open, and the spring night came in, cool and clean, carrying the smell of cut grass and early roses, and the particular freshness that follows a day of rare and total sunshine. And they stepped out together into it. Above them, the stars were out. Proper stars, the unambiguous kind, the kind that appear only when the sky is fully committed to darkness. She looked up at them for a moment, her hand in his. The topiary hairs were behind them now, no longer visible. But she knew. She could hold it as a fact, solid and without qualification, that they were still there in the dark, still at the top of their arc, still flying.
This story is about one day, one strange, magical Easter day. But really, it is not about the egg, it is about the spell. It is about two people who already knew. They knew for a long time. They just didn't say it, because say it in